facts. My name is Prachi. The original rainbow gay pride flag had 8 stripes on it and was designed by Gilbert Baker in 1978. And this is a video where I anti-haul and dupe the vibes of the Natasha Denona Sunrise Palette. Happy Pride Month! After what felt like the world's longest hiatus, Miss Kimberly Clark is back on YouTube just in time to bless us for June 20 by Teen. So, in her honor, I'm going to do a very specific anti-haul. It's an anti-haul for the Natasha Denona Sunrise Palette. There's a lot of hype around Natasha Denona whenever she releases anything, and so I just wanted to kind of calm us all down, bring us back to earth, discuss the Sunrise Palette, and dupe the vibes. So this video is actually going to have 3 parts. I'm gonna put timestamps for each of those parts down in the description box below, but the 3 parts are as follows. Now the first section, which I also think is probably the most exciting section, is gonna be the one where I actually dupe color by color each of the eyeshadows in the Natasha Denona Sunrise Palette. In the second part, I'm gonna zoom out for a second, and I'm going to talk about Natasha Denona eyeshadows as a whole. So not just the Sunrise Palette, but all of the other eyeshadow palettes, and I'm gonna specifically discuss certain things that you should maybe keep in mind, maybe certain arguments that people put in favor for buying those palettes, certain questions to maybe ask yourself before you consider purchasing one of them. I've been thinking a lot about Natasha Denona eyeshadows recently, and I've sort of crystallized my thoughts and feelings into what I hope will be a bit of a helpful guideline for you if you're a person who really wants Natasha Denona palettes. And the final section of the video, I'm gonna get a little bit personal, a little bit petty, to discuss my feelings around the color story and setup and everything of the Sunrise Palette. For those of you who are curious about my eye look, I must apologize and say that I'm not going to be showing it. I'm filming at 6:40 in the morning, and I ironically did my makeup as the sun was rising, and I didn't have time to film it because in about an hour and a half, I'm gonna need to leave for class. I will say that how I got this eye look is by actually following a tutorial for the Natasha Denona Sunrise Palette, using the dupes I have in my own collection for the Natasha Denona eyeshadows. So if you like this eye look, congratulate Kelsey Brianna J, because it's her brilliant mind that came up with it, and also know that you can achieve it without the Natasha Denona Sunrise Palette. The last thing I'm gonna need to say in this intro is to give a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm probably gonna be pretty hyperbolic in this video. Like, I'm gonna use a lot of hyperbole, and that's because the way everyone talks about makeup in the beauty YouTube community is really hyperbolic. It's usually in a very positive direction, saying that this is the most amazing, life-changing, jaw-dropping product in the planet. What I'm doing is I'm channeling that same hyperbolic energy into anti-consumerism. So don't take it serious, don't take it personal. I'm not like insulting your ancestors or your mom. If you already bought the palette, or if you watch this video and you still decide to buy the palette, I don't think you're an idiot or a fool or that you've succumbed to capitalism or something like that. In fact, I'm probably proud of you, because what that means is that you sat and you watched this very long video that made you hopefully examine your own makeup collection, that questioned you, and at the end of all of that thought and evaluation, you still decided this was a good idea. And really, at the end of the day, that's all I want. I don't want people to never buy makeup again. I don't want anyone to boycott Natasha Denona. I just want everybody in this world to think long and hard. That's what she said, or he said, or they said. What up, Pride? What was I saying? I just want everybody to think really carefully about the makeup that they buy. So if you make the decision that this is a good palette for you after giving it due thought and consideration, congratulations, and have fun with your new palette. So now that that disclaimer is done, let's get it. All right, fellas, let's get down into discussing the dupes. Now, here I have to give the world's biggest shout out and thank you to Temptalia. If you, for some reason, don't know who Temptalia is, or have never gone on her website and used some of its features, I'm about to change your life. Temptalia is a website run by one of the most badass women in the world called Christine. And what Christine does is she reviews and swatches makeup. And for all of the makeup that she reviews and swatches, she finds dupes. And not only does she find dupes, but she also lets you compare swatches of any 2 products side by side so that you can identify and figure out how similar eyeshadows you already own are to what you're thinking of buying. In fact, she has a feature where she lets you dupe your entire vanity, and it takes some time and energy to set up, but if you're like really into that kind of stuff, I would look into it. The reason why I'm bringing her up is because Her review of the Natasha Denona eyeshadow palette is where I'm getting most of these dupes from. Those that I didn't get from her review, those that I like discovered myself, I was able to do so because I was able to use the compare to swatches function of her website to find that, hey, this thing I own actually is really similar to the color in the Sunrise palette. So I'm gonna put the link to her review of the Sunrise palette as well as a link to the compare any two swatches down in the description box below. If you're seriously considering buying not just the Natasha Denona palette, but any eyeshadow palette or even like a lipstick or something like that, and you wanna make sure that it's not a dupe for something you already own in your collection, Temptalia, one of the best resources in the world. So if you're seriously considering buying the Sunrise palette, definitely check her review out. See if you already have some of those dupes. The ones I'm going to discuss are the ones that I have in my own collection. And if for some reason you haven't watched my makeup collection video and you're thinking that I'm the kind of person who owns like Alex drawers and Alex drawers full of makeup, and I have so many different eyeshadow palettes and that's why I was able to pull dupes, I'm gonna have to correct you, lads. I don't even have enough eyeshadow to fill one drawer of like that Alex dresser. I found all of the dupes in like 4 eyeshadow palettes in my collection. And the fact that I was able to do that with like my relatively paltry collection of eyeshadows and eyeshadow palettes is what really inspired me to make this video. Because I'm a person who's always thought that my eyeshadow game is weak and that I don't have enough eyeshadows. And if a person like me can still dupe pretty much every single color in the Sunrise palette, I have high hopes for you as well. So we're gonna go color by color. If you see me looking down, it's because I have my notes here because like I got all the names and brands and everything for you. The first color is Poppy. Now, Temptalia herself notes that the color Poppy is super duper similar to another color within the same Sunrise palette, Phlox. So know that most of the things that I'm saying for Poppy also apply for Phlox. The dupe that I have for it in my own collection is from the Bad Habit Supernova palette, which is the dupe of the Natasha Denona Lila palette, and it's the color Flare. Now, I'm not just going to discuss the dupes I have and swatch them. I'm also going to list off some of the other really common palettes that contain dupes according to Temptalia. Here are some other options. If you own the ColourPop Lit palette, Mercy is a very good dupe. If you were one of the people who splurged and bought the Pat McGrath Mothership palette in Bronze Seduction, that beautiful red color Blitz Flame, she's a dupe too. And if you were one of those people who bought the Huda Beauty Mauve Obsessions palette, the first color in the second row, that one's also a dupe. Moving on to the color Citrine, the most precise dupe is actually another one from the ColourPop Lit palette in the color Clio Amore. I don't have that eyeshadow palette. What I do have though is another eyeshadow that Temptalia lists as a dupe for Citrine, and that's Mischief in the ColourPop Yes Please palette. If you happen to purchase that Too Faced Clover palette, the yellow shade Good Boy, spot on dupe. If you also bought the Kat Von D Mi Vida Loca remix palette, Fran and Citrine are dupes. And if you still have your ABH subculture, the color Edge is also pretty spot on. Next up is the color Phlox, which is the color that's really similar to the first one we discussed, Poppy. And so pretty much all of the dupes that Temptalia lists for Poppy are also dupes for Phlox. Phlox is just the slightest bit warmer than Poppy. And so one of the additional dupes that Temptalia lists for Phlox that isn't listed for Poppy is the shade Bling from the ColourPop Yes Please palette. Next up, we have the color Awakening, which is a duochrome, and therefore an eyeshadow that's much harder to dupe. I looked through all of the ones that Temptalia had suggested. I didn't own any of them, and nor did any of them seem like they would be particularly accessible to people. So this is one of those shades where I suddenly had a hunch, and I decided to use the compare to swatches function on her website. And what I compared was the eyeshadow Awakening to the topmost shade in this Kaja Beauty bento box in Orange Blossom. This is also a very beautiful textured duochromy glitter, and turns out it's a pretty spot on dupe for Awakening. The next color in the Sunrise palette is Laurel. Interestingly enough, Temptalia lists the color Vermeer from the Anastasia Modern Renaissance palette as a dupe. Now, I personally don't own the Anastasia Modern Renaissance palette. Before you gasp and exit this video and call me like a fake beauty YouTuber, because what beauty YouTuber doesn't have the Modern Renaissance palette, know that it was a very, very deliberate choice on my part, and one that I made purely because of the packaging. I come from a family of dry cleaners. When I see stained cloth, it physically pains me. And so the idea of constantly having this dirty suede palette in my makeup collection, that feels like a personal affront, not just to me and my own sensibilities, but to my ancestors and the dry cleaner DNA that they passed on down to me. Instead of buying the Modern Renaissance, I actually bought the Wet n Wild Rosé in the Air, and the one shimmery color here is a pretty spot-on dupe for Primavera, which is a pretty spot-on dupe for Laurel. If you don't own either the Rosé in the Air or the Anastasia Modern Renaissance palette, here are a couple more dupes. If you bought the Biba palette by Natasha Denona, the color Monroe is very, very similar. If you bought the Too Faced Gingerbread palette this past Christmas, Spiked Eggnog is a dupe for Laurel. The next shade, Aster, is a duochrome purple. And this was the most difficult shade for me personally to dupe given my collection. However, when you actually check Temptalia's website, she has some very spot-on dupes for it that I just don't happen to own. For example, if you own the Desert Dusk palette by Huda Beauty, the color Twilight is almost exactly the same as Aster. And for those of you who are about to say that Aster, being a Natasha Denona eyeshadow, is gonna far outperform the Huda Beauty Twilight, note that Temptalia specifically said that the shade Aster gave her quite a bit of trouble to use, and that she gave Natasha Denona's Aster a B and Huda Beauty's Twilight a B-. So as controversial as I know Huda Beauty's textured eyeshadows can be, this particular Natasha Denona purpley duochrome is at the same level as that Huda Beauty one. If you don't own the Desert Dusk palette, nor are you interested in buying a palette, but maybe you're in the market for a single, the ColourPop Jelly Much eyeshadow in Big Ego, also listed as a dupe. Now, like I said, I own neither of those two things, so what I ended up doing in order to mimic the effects of Aster, which is the color that I have on my lower lash line, I used the bottommost glittery color in the Kaja Bento box. It's like a duochrome brown, and then I layered a purple single eyeshadow that I had on top of it. I decided to layer Stars and Rockets, which is a more cool-toned duochrome purple with a pink shift. I would suggest layering like a cooler purple over a shimmery or glittery warm brown. The next shade is Glory, and in the year of our Lord 2019, there are so many dupes for shades like Glory. Anastasia Modern Renaissance Love Letter, dupe. Wet n Wild Rosé in the Air, dupe. If you don't own either of those two eyeshadow palettes, but you do own any of the following three ColourPop palettes, Lit, Rendezvous, Element of Surprise, all three of those palettes contain dupes for the color Glory. Lastly, if you own the Urban Decay Naked Cherry palette, the color Bing is also a dupe. Next up, we have the color Azalea, which again is one of those like beautiful shimmery metallics that Natasha Denona does. If you're one of those people who was really enamored by the hourglass scattered lights and you happen to buy the color Blaze, Blaze and Azalea are exact dupes. If you own the ColourPop Yes Please palette, the shade Louis is a dupe. And if you don't have Yes Please from ColourPop, but you have Give It To Me Straight, the color Straight Up is also listed as a dupe. The last listed dupe for Azalea comes from the Anastasia Beverly Hills Soft Glam palette, and the color Rose Pink. Next up, we have the color Morgan. And I know you're probably looking at Morgan and you're like, that's a very basic matte color. Ironically, this is the color that was the hardest for me to dupe. And that's actually kind of deliberate because I prefer warmer and more saturated versions of the color Morgan. If you aren't me and you actually want the exact shade Morgan, don't worry though. If you own any of the following three Anastasia Beverly Hills palettes, Subculture, Prism, or the current Alyssa Edwards collab, there are shades in each of them that dupe Morgan. If you own the Huda Beauty Desert Dusk palette, the shade Eden is a dupe. If you own the ColourPop Soul palette, the shade Dynamite is a dupe. And if you're not into eyeshadow palettes and you want just one single to perfectly approximate Morgan, the ColourPop Pressed Single Eyeshadow in Best Coast has got your back. I own none of these exact dupes, but looking at my own eyeshadow collection and then comparing swatches on Temptalia's site, the two options that I've come up with that are pretty close are the Single Eyeshadow Rule by MAC, which is a little more warm tone than Morgan, aka what I like, or, since I've already brought this palette up a bunch, the shade Big Cocktails in the ColourPop Yes Please palette, which is actually just a slightly more saturated version of Morgan. And the best way to tone down the saturation is to just layer that eyeshadow with the color right next to it, Champs. When I layer the paler peach Champs over Big Cocktails, I get a color that's really close to Morgan. We are more than halfway done, lads. The next shade is Agate. If you own the Tarte Chrome Paint pot thingy in the shade Top Yacht, that's a pretty spot on dupe for Agate. Additionally, if you bought the Pat McGrath Bronze Seduction Mothership eyeshadow palette, Skin Show Divine Glow, also a dupe. Within my own collection, the best dupe comes from this ColourPop Yes Please palette with that pale gold shade Buttercake. There are 3 pretty accessible dupes for the next eyeshadow, Clove. The first one is the shade Celestial from the Bad Habit Supernova palette. The shade TMI from the ColourPop Give It To Me Straight palette is also listed as a dupe, as is the shade All-Star from Anastasia Beverly Hills' Subculture palette. Next up is the matte eyeshadow Carnelian. If Carnelian is the color that has really caught your eye because you don't have anything like it in your makeup collection, the single eyeshadows Chickadee by Makeup Geek and Koi by ColourPop are really good dupes. Dupes can also be found in the ColourPop Sweet Talk and Through My Eyes palette, and in the Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette with the shade Creamsicle. I own none of those things, but I do own the shade Rule by MAC, which is pretty close to Carnelian, and it's just slightly less orangey yellow. Next up, we have the shade Jasper. I actually own 3 of the listed dupes for Jasper. The first is the NARS single eyeshadow in Persia. The second dupe I own is Red Brick by MAC. And the third dupe I own is the color GNO in the ColourPop Yes Please palette. If you don't own any of those colors, but you own the Anastasia Beverly Hills Prism palette, the Urban Decay Born to Run palette, or the Colored Rain Queen of Hearts palette, there's a dupe for the shade Jasper in all 3 of them. Next, we have the shade Morning. If you own the Natasha Denona Tropic palette, Sahara is a dupe. If you own the Dominique Cosmetics Lemonade palette, Mango is a dupe. If you don't own either of those eyeshadow palettes and you just want one single to perfectly capture the color Morning, ColourPop's got your back with Paper Tiger. I own none of those, but I went back to my trusty good old friend ColourPop Yes Please palette, and I layered the light peachy matte color Champs with the yellow color Mischief to get what I think is a pretty close approximation of the shade Morning. The final eyeshadow in the Natasha Denona Sunrise palette is the shade Dayspring. It's a beautiful shimmery bronze color, and I am a sucker for a beautiful shimmery bronze color, but it is such an infinitely dupeable color that Temptalia's website has 4 full pages of dupes just for the color Dayspring. Most colors get like 1.5 to 2 pages of dupes. Dayspring has 4 pages of dupes. If you own one of the Hourglass Scattered Lights in the shade Foil, that's a dupe. ColourPop's Loose Pigment in the color Mulholland, spot on dupe. If you own Pat McGrath palettes, specifically those like smaller 6-pan Pat McGrath eyeshadow palettes, you probably have a dupe for Dayspring, because Temptalia states that the La Vie en Rose palette, the Dark Star palette, and the Bronze Ambition palette all have golden bronze shades that dupe Dayspring. Within my own eyeshadow collection, there are also a whole bunch of dupes. If you own either the colors Amber Lights or Woodwinked by MAC, it's really not that far off. If you own the Smashbox Cover Shot eyeshadow palette in Ablaze, the shade Moccasin is also a really good functional dupe. If you own any liquid glitter eyeshadows, like the Stila Magnificent Metals or the ones that I have, which are from the Korean brand Peripera, it would also probably behoove you to check if you own a bronzy gold over there, because odds are it's gonna give you the same effect. And those are all of the dupes, y'all. Pretty much every single color in the Natasha Denona Sunrise palette is a color I already own. And odds are they're colors that you probably already own too. Because the thing about the Sunrise palette is that it's old. And I don't mean old like the conspiracy theory about the Jaclyn Hill lipsticks or whatever that's going around. I mean old as in like the color story is old. It's been done before. When I first saw the Sunrise palette color story, I was like, oh, so this is the Desert Dusk palette by Huda Beauty with a little bit of yellow. And then the more I sort of looked at it and thought about it, I was like, we've seen colors like this over and over and over again. There are so many eyeshadow palettes out there that have already given us these colors and this type of a color story. The Violet Voss Holy Grail, the Anastasia Modern Renaissance. It's been a couple of years now that these type of warm toned eyeshadows have been on the market. These like berry toned reds, these warm orangey browns, even the yellows. And a thing to really like consider and ask yourself is if by this point in 2019, I have not already bought and do not already own all of those colors. Why is that? Is that probably because I'm actually not a person who likes or wears those colors? If you're a person who really loves and has been into makeup for a couple of years, by this point in time, by June 2019, if you don't own any like peachy orange mattes, berry and red toned eyeshadows, yellow and like pinky purple, that's probably a deliberate choice that you've made because you don't wear those eyeshadows. And if up until now, with the proliferation of all of those colors already on the market, you have never bought or tried out those eyeshadows, is an $85 palette the test run that you want to do to see if you like those colors? Maybe the answer is yes for you. Maybe you do have those funds, but it's just a thing to think about. Natasha Denona has changed the game before. Like when the Sunset palette came out with that vibrant yellow and matte red, that was a game changer. This ColourPop Yes Please palette with its color story is a direct consequence of the Natasha Denona Sunset palette, because Natasha Denona brought yellow eyeshadows back. When she came out with the Lila palette, that was also pretty game-changing. We hadn't seen eyeshadow palettes that look like this in a really long time. And it was so radical and fascinating that the company Bad Habit produced a pretty high-quality dupe of the Lila palette. Natasha Denona has been game-changing and set trends before. But the Sunrise palette is not an example of that. The Sunrise palette is to Natasha Denona what the Naked Heat palette was to Urban Decay. Do you guys remember when Urban Decay announced that they were finally going to release a Naked Heat palette? Do you remember how the response of the entire beauty community was just like, really? Now? Like a solid year and a half after every single person has already bought all of the warm tone reddish orange eyeshadows they could possibly desire? That's what the Sunrise palette is. It's following trends, not setting them. It's following the yellow eyeshadows, the warm eyeshadows, the iridescent pinky purples that were so prominent in the Desert Dusk and Norvina and ColourPop Ooh La La palettes. Again, reminder of the disclaimer. I'm not saying that if you're buying Natasha Denona eyeshadow palettes that you're an idiot clown who doesn't know what to do with their money and is just making dumb decisions. I'm not saying that at all. I'm just giving you some food for thought so that you can really thoughtfully look at your makeup collection, your budget, your desires, and make good decisions that are right for you. And that decision might be, yeah, I'm gonna buy the Sunrise palette, or it might be, no, I'm gonna sit this one out, thanks. And keeping that in mind, I wanna use this section of the video to kind of provide some more guidelines and guiding questions if you're considering buying Natasha Denona eyeshadow palettes. And not just the Sunrise palette, but any of the Natasha Denona eyeshadow palettes, especially the bigger size palettes. So the Sunset, Lila, Gold, Star, those really big 28 pan palettes, that kind of stuff. Because yeah, perhaps you look at the Sunrise palette and you realize, oh, I already own those colors, but maybe you're looking at some of the bigger palettes like the Lila palette or the Gold palette and you want to make the leap. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't make that leap. I'm just here as like your trusty little friend to be one small voice inside your brain to consider when making a decision. And the first thing that I want to discuss is one of the most common arguments that gets used. I see it all the time on Reddit forums, I see it all the time even on YouTube, what I like to call the price per gram argument. And that's the argument that actually Natasha Denona eyeshadows aren't exorbitantly priced, they aren't expensive at all. Why? Because Natasha Denona's eyeshadow pans are much bigger than the average eyeshadow pan. You get a lot more product per eyeshadow, and if you actually break down the cost by price per gram, Natasha Denona's pricing falls in line and is in fact a little bit more reasonable than cheaper brands. Things like Huda Beauty, Urban Decay, Anastasia, etc. And that argument is I was about to say it's BS, but that's not actually quite true, because it's actually a good argument, but only when it's applied to the correct people. And what I'm gonna do right now is outline exactly who that argument is appropriate for and to whom that argument absolutely does not apply. Price per gram is a relevant and good argument only if you use up every last bit of an eyeshadow. Not just hitting pan on an eyeshadow. I don't just mean you used it enough that you see a flash of metal on the bottom. I mean using up the entire pan. Every last gram of eyeshadow in that pan, you used it up. Keep that fact in mind while I give you another fact, which is that Natasha Denona eyeshadows are known to change their formula over time. In this regard, they're actually very similar to Anastasia Beverly Hills eyeshadows, which is that when you get the palette and it's a new palette, they have this incredible texture. They're creamy, they're buttery, they're rich. That is the result of certain like binding agents and stuff that they put into the eyeshadow. And as time passes, those things that make your eyeshadow feel really creamy and buttery and have this almost like wet, incredible texture despite being powder eyeshadows, those things evaporate into the air. Quite a few people who own Natasha Denona eyeshadow palettes talk about how over time, like a year and a half, 2 years after they've bought the Natasha Denona eyeshadow palettes, the texture has noticeably changed on a lot of the like creamy feeling mattes and metallics. This, by the way, is not just like one stray person being like, these eyeshadows go bad. This is like, no, like everybody admits that Natasha Denona eyeshadows change texture over time. Because actually, all eyeshadows change texture over time, but with brands like Natasha Denona and ABH, it's just really noticeable because the initial version of the eyeshadow palette that you get is just so creamy and buttery. So considering those two things that I just said, pause and think and ask yourself the following questions. When was the last time you hit pan on an eyeshadow? When was the last time you used an eyeshadow all the way up? What colors were those eyeshadows? How many eyeshadows do you currently own? How frequently do you wear eyeshadows? Those are the 5 questions that I think would be really, really good to reflect on and come up with good answers for yourself. Because they're the kinds of questions that will help you determine, are you really going to finish all of the Natasha Denona eyeshadows in a palette before they change in formula and stop being as good? Are you truly the kind of person who somehow doesn't wear enough eyeshadow that you already own a whole bunch of other eyeshadows, but you're also a person who will wear these Natasha Denona eyeshadows you're about to buy frequently enough that you actually finish them up? Not just hit pan, finish them up before they go bad. Only if you are somehow the person that I just described. A person with little to no eyeshadows who's about to buy a Natasha Denona palette and will then use that Natasha Denona palette almost exclusively pretty much every day for a year and a half, or 2 years. Only if you're this person that I just described does that price per gram argument that people throw around so frequently when discussing Natasha Denona actually make sense and apply. If you're not that person, whatever anyone is telling you about price per gram is irrelevant. You're not going to use up every last gram. And that means that any of these arguments that actually Natasha Denona palettes are like cost effective because price per gram, whatever, they're garbage. They're worthless. They don't apply to you, and you should disregard them entirely. If you're a person who's not going to use up every single gram of the Natasha Denona eyeshadow, then that price is in no way, shape, or form reasonable. It's really expensive, it's exorbitant, it's a luxury. It just is. So, having said that, what factors make or don't make the eyeshadow palette worth that exorbitant cost? And here I'm going to use myself as an example because, hi, I'm talking from my own experience. And once again, I'd like to reiterate, this is not a video telling you what you should do. It's not a prescriptive video. I'm not telling you that you should or shouldn't buy Natasha Denona eyeshadows. I'm just throwing some questions out there for people to maybe consider. For me personally, I'm a Canadian. I live in Ontario. Those larger 15 pan palettes, the gold, Lila, sunset, those cost $170 Canadian. With a 13% sales tax in Ontario, the price for one of those palettes turns out to be roughly $192. The 18 pan star palette is $223 Canadian before tax, $252 with tax. And those even larger 28 pan palettes, like the green, brown, and that like purple one, those are $305 before tax, $345 after tax. That is the cost of Natasha Denona eyeshadow palettes for me. I would suggest that you actually calculate the price including sales tax for wherever you are if you're trying to make decisions around the Natasha Denona palettes. Is the eyeshadow formula for Natasha Denona really that much better that it is worth it for you? And this is again where it's like it's personal and individualized to different people and their budgets and how much they care about eyeshadow and all of that kind of stuff. I really wanted the Natasha Denona Lila palette. And to sort of soothe myself, and because I heard that this was a very good dupe, and because actually Temptalia rated even the qualities of the eyeshadows themselves as quite good, I instead bought this Bad Habit Supernova palette, which is a relatively functional dupe for the Natasha Denona Lila in terms of color. And I'm saying this as a person who lives in Toronto, has access to Natasha Denona palettes in Sephora stores, and has played with, swatched, put on my own eyes, actual eyeshadows from the Natasha Denona Lila palette. And I ordered this palette from the US, and at the end of all of it, shipping, blah, blah, whatever, I got it for something like $30 Canadian. The Lila palette, if you will recall my previous statement, is $192 with tax. That means that the Lila palette is 6 times more expensive than this Bad Habit Supernova eyeshadow palette. There is no earthly way in which I think the Lila palette is 6 times better in quality than this. Absolutely not. At most, I would say that the Lila palette is twice as good as this. So if the Lila palette was priced more around the Urban Decay palette range, I think an Urban Decay Naked palette is something like $66 in Canada. If the Lila palette had been priced in that range, I'd probably have saved and bought the Lila palette because the difference in quality versus the difference in price would have matched. But if I were to sit here and try to tell you that the Lila palette was truly 6 times better in quality than this, I would not be saying what I felt was the truth, because it's not true for me. And so the sort of guideline that I want to give to everybody is like, think of eyeshadows you actually genuinely really enjoy using that are not Natasha Denona eyeshadows. Then compare the price of those eyeshadows to the price of Natasha Denona eyeshadows. Then compare the quality. What's going on there? Is there a mismatch? Are you personally okay with that mismatch? Is your budget okay with that mismatch? And then use that to like make decisions. Some other factors to consider when buying one of those really big Natasha Denona palettes is, how do you do your makeup? How do you store your makeup? Lila, Gold, Star, and those like big 28 pans especially, they're large, bulky palettes. These two palettes are really tiny, really compact. And so some factors to consider are, where do you do your makeup? How do you store your makeup? For me personally, the Natasha Denona eyeshadow palettes are way too bulky because I don't have a vanity. It is very rare that I actually do my makeup sitting down in my house. The days when I'm filming are usually the only days where I'm actually like sitting down and doing eyeshadow, because most of the rest of the time I'm on the go and doing my makeup on a commute. And so for me and my lifestyle, the size of Natasha Denona palettes just absolutely don't make sense. It might make sense for you. Another factor to consider is, how much does your makeup get knocked around? Do you put makeup like in your purse? Are you carrying it around a lot, moving around with it, traveling a lot? And the reason why that's an important factor to just look at in your own life is because Natasha Denona eyeshadows are notoriously fragile. There are so many YouTube videos, Reddit posts, Instagram posts, etc., where people talk about how a palette dropped and the Natasha Denona eyeshadow just crumbled, or like people who would just have an entire pan of eyeshadow fall out onto the ground. Are you okay with that risk? Is that gonna bother you? If you're a person who's like never gonna travel with that palette, if you're a person who knows that that palette is gonna like stay in a drawer or on top of a dresser and that you're basically only ever going to use it while like sitting down there, maybe that's not an issue for you. But me personally, I'm constantly doing my makeup on public transit, on buses, streetcars, and subways. And the idea of one of my beautiful metallic duochrome, exquisitely expensive Natasha Denona luxury eyeshadows just plopping right out of the pan on the gross, wet, slushy floor of a streetcar at 8:30 a.m. on a rainy day in Toronto? Hell no! So the fragility of the eyeshadows is also definitely a thing to consider. And part of the reason why I specifically like separated this out is because the Sunrise palette is like a new style of palette. Different packaging, smaller pan sizes, lower price. So, you know, like these are just questions and stuff to keep in mind. Like none of this is prescriptive, and we don't know with like this new palette if like that fragility issue is like still a thing. And I suppose this is where I'm gonna transition to sort of the more personal third part of the video, where I'm just kind of like being a little like petty and personal about my own feelings around the Sunrise palette. No one is more disappointed in what the Sunrise palette looks like than me, y'all. I really played myself, because here's the thing, and it's such a dumb reason, but you know what? I'm allowed to be personal and petty on my own YouTube channel. Thank you very much. Those of you who watched my fun facts about Prachi video, y'all know that my actual name, Prachi, the literal meaning of it is like from or of the east. But the name has a very, very strong connotation of east where the sun rises, east where a new day begins, east where dawn occurs. And that connotation is so intrinsically tied in with the name Prachi. A bunch of websites will tell you that it means Eastern, from or of the East, but a bunch of other websites will tell you that it means dawn, sunrise, morning, first light. So when I heard that Natasha Denona was coming out with a sunrise palette, and when I heard that it wasn't going to be that like super exorbitant, well over $100 CAD price, but that it was actually going to be priced at around like $85 Canadian, which is the price of a Huda Beauty palette, and it's something like feasible that I could save up for as like a beautiful treat to myself, I was ecstatic. Certain shades are so close to each other that I kind of want to go like, was that really the best use of space in an eyeshadow palette? The fact that Phlox and Poppy are just like so similar on the eyes, and the absence of like a really rich blue purple color, I think like maybe even a more intense, slightly deeper, richer version of this, that would have extended the range of the palette by so much actually if they had put like a rich purple in there and then maybe even like a more of a blue navy color instead of having like those two shimmers that look really similar to each other, and a couple of the mattes are like also pretty close. There's like two really pale champagne-y gold colors. I'm like, you could have, you know, just picked one of them and instead added one or two pieces that still made sense in the context of a sunrise, but which would have given this palette an even greater range and just like breadth of color. Especially because like, I don't know what kind of sunrises Natasha Denona has been looking at, but for me personally, a sunrise is not just beautiful because of the warm toned colors at the bottom. What makes a sunrise beautiful is seeing the gradation from the sun all the way back up into the night sky. So the transitions to yellow, orange, reddish pinks, purple, and eventually the blue of the night sky. The night sky too is a part of the sunrise. And so part of me just like looks at the sunrise palette and is like, one or two minor tweaks would have just really leveled that palette up, because then you'd have a palette that doesn't just have the classic warm tone shades, but actually allows you to transition from those warm tones into purple, which is simultaneously a warm and cool color, and then into a bit of blue. I'm imagining the versatility of that in my head, especially because some of the duochromes have a silvery shift to them. So then you can have like night sky style, more blue, purple, silvery looks, but then also like pinks and oranges, reds, yellows. Additionally, the layout of the palette really bothers me. I feel like there was a missed opportunity. I feel like it would have been really cool if she had actually laid out the eyeshadows so that it looked like a sunrise, so that you could sort of see the gradation. Like if I were a person releasing a sunrise palette, like if you were ever to get like a Prachi palette and it was like sunrise theme, like that's what I would have done. It would have been like you open the palette in the landscape or in the portrait mode, you would have actually seen a very beautiful gradation like a sunrise. So I feel like that's also like an artistic thing that would have leveled up the eyeshadow palette. Is it petty? Yeah, but like, I was genuinely so excited for this palette. And the fact that it was just kind of like meh, the fact that it was just ordinary and not extraordinary is disappointing. When it comes to Natasha Denona, I expect extraordinary, especially for that price. I don't think I'm wrong for that. I feel like I just like tore into that palette, and I feel like I've given you all the false impression that I think it's like a hideous palette and the worst thing in the world. It's not. It's a good palette. It's a beautiful palette. And were I a person of different means with a different budget and in the mood to really just treat myself, I probably would buy it. In fact, like maybe a year and a half from now, when some of my existing eyeshadows have kicked the bucket, I might buy it because it's themed around the meaning of my own name, because those are beautiful colors that I use a lot. Pinks, purples, oranges, reds. Yellow is my favorite color of all time. So there's no saying that I'm never going to buy it or I think it's ridiculous to purchase it. I expected something groundbreaking from it and it didn't quite deliver. Not everything needs to be groundbreaking, but me, who I am right now, well, who I am right now is a person on a no-buy, but even beyond then, I want to only add things into my collection which are extraordinary. Things which truly enrich and add robustly to my makeup collection. The Sunrise palette, as beautiful as it is, the fact that I was able to dupe it entirely from things that I already own, it has shown itself to not be one of those things. It doesn't, oh, that is my alarm. So, it's it's time for me to go to school. It doesn't level up what I'm able to do with my eyeshadows. The fact that I was able to pretty faithfully recreate Kelsey Brianna J's looks on my own eyes with stuff I already own truly means it's not adding that much to my life. So since my alarm went off, which means I need to exit the house in 10 minutes, I'm going to wrap up this video. Thank you so much for watching. And as always, I hope you have a great upcoming week. And even if your upcoming week ends up becoming messy and imperfect, I hope you're still able to create and experience some truly beautiful moments. Bye!